In this video, I'll show you how to paint clouds with gouache. I'll show you several different techniques, talk about supplies, and how different ways of using the brushes and paint affects the final result. If you're interested in taking this to the next step, I have a full tutorial over on my Patreon page for how I incorporate clouds into my scenes. But otherwise, I hope you enjoy today's tutorial, so let's get started. Whenever I'm doing a study session involving clouds, I like to pull up a variety of cloud types. And by that I mean I'm looking at the shape of the clouds and the way they look like they're flowing across the sky. For instance, in these two, you can see the clouds are very wispy. They're very elongated and soft. They don't really have a noticeable edge to them. It almost looks like a long exposure shot to me, but it's not. It's just the way the clouds were that day, as opposed to these, which are very fluffy and have a very noticeable edge in a lot of places. I guess this is what you would say when you mean big, white, fluffy clouds in the sky. What I like to do in my paintings is use a combination of these. I lean a little bit more towards these types of clouds because I really like to utilize the directional brush strokes as part of my composition. I like how this cloud is sort of diagonal here and it's mimicked in the reflection here. It creates that nice shape that draws us down into the cliff. It is part of the composition. Whereas these types of clouds maybe draw the focus a bit more, and they might even be the actual subject of the painting. In this case, because it's such a strong cloud and where it's placed, it's really distracting me from everything else in the painting. So this type of cloud scene, I might be painting it specifically for the cloud and not necessarily what's happening in the landscape. If I'm painting a very complicated scene, maybe something like this where I'm focusing on the cliffs and the rocks, this type of wispy soft cloud in the background is perfect because it doesn't distract me, it doesn't draw my attention at all. It's just a bright sunny day, and there's little hints of that in the sky, but all of my attention can be here. So you can utilize clouds as part of your focus or just as a supporting character in the background. It just depends what kind of scene you're painting. And of course, these types of clouds are much different than like a sunset scene, which involves a lot of color and a lot of interesting lighting effects. We're not going to touch on that today. That can be a different lesson. But for now, let's jump into a couple small studies to get into the cloud mindset. Just going to divide my paper into a few sections to do some small studies. Doesn't matter if they're the same size. For brushes, I kind of go back and forth between using flat and round brushes or something with a soft edge like a filbert, but I try to use my larger brushes to start and then I'll switch to smaller and smaller brushes as I go. You definitely want to have a paper towel or a clean rag of some kind because we very often will use that to pick up some of the color. Speaking of color, I'm going to be using a very limited palette just to keep things simple. I'll be using lots and lots of white, some ultramarine, or you could use any blue. I'm going to use a tiny bit of burnt umber here and there because sometimes the bottom of the cloud is a little heavier, and mixing burnt umber and ultramarine gives you kind of a nice natural gray. You could also use black if you don't have that or if you prefer that color. So let's load up lots of our color. The last thing I want to do is run out of paint during the painting process, so I'm going to be generous with my color on the palette. Although I need a lot less burnt umber than the other colors because it'll just be for little touches here and there. One thing I'll demonstrate is the difference between using gouache more like watercolor, as in more diluted, and using it thick. So we'll do a few more like watercolor to start. I think that's a little easier to start with. And then we'll talk about adding more gouache into it, using it a little thicker. If it helps, you can sketch in where you want your clouds to be. In this case, I'm going to be doing some wispy clouds, so they'll just be kind of like this. And then maybe in this one, I'll do a little bit of a different color combination, maybe more gray. And maybe in this one, I just want to get some swirls, I don't know. And then in the middle, we're going to go with more of a fluffy Some areas will be a little softer. I'm not pressing hard with my pencil, I'm just keeping it very minimal. And it's up to you to decide if you want to draw the outline of your cloud or think about it as you're drawing the outline of the blue sky. Because technically, if we're using it more like watercolor, we're actually painting around our clouds for the most part. And then at the very bottom, we'll do some big fluffy clouds, like with a very hard edge. And I'm not really concerned with how messy this looks at the moment because it's just a guide to make sure I save the areas I want to be white. So I always have my paper towel just in case, ready to go. For the very wispy clouds, what I like to do is start by getting my paper wet. I probably should have taped on the edges because it might buckle a little bit, but I'm not too worried. I'm not going to try to get it really, really wet. Just dip the tip of my brush in the blue. See how diluted that is? It's very, you can see the palette through it really easily. And maybe a little bit of white just to slightly desaturate it. You don't have to add white at this point, but once we touch it onto the paper, technically I'm trying to think about how I'm painting around my cloud at this point. So very soft. Some of the edges are a little harder and you even have a little dry brush in there now and then, but then I'll clean my brush off, it's nice and damp, and I'll soften any of the edges I want. If you're using 100% cotton paper, you'll have a little more time to play with it. This is actually cellulose paper. It's not ideal for going back in and messing with it. So I pretty much commit to it once I put the paint down. If this is how it looks, that's how it's gonna stay. Because if I try to go in and mess with this blue, it's gonna be really splotchy and show all of my brush strokes. If this was really nice, thick, 100% cotton paper, I could go in and play with that a lot more. Well, this is why we do practice sessions like this, to get a feel for how the paper and the paint react with each other before you jump into a bigger scene. So in this one, I'm going to add a bit of gray. So I'm going to get the paper wet. I'm having the streaks go the other way this time, or the clouds, I mean. And touch in my blue sky. And now we're going to use a tiny bit of burnt umber mixed in with that blue, and it automatically becomes gray. And then I'm going to clean my brush off and get a nice soft edge and kind of sweep it in. So it's kind of a back and forth between adding, it's a bit too much blue up there, adding the blue, getting clean water on the brush, getting gray, and I tend to work really fast because, especially on this type of paper, I have to. Otherwise, all of my brush strokes are going to be streaky. So, have a game plan going into it. Put your blue down, then sweep some clean water on it to get it soft, then add your gray, or whatever order works for you. I can already see that the way this is drying is going to leave a bit of a streak there, so it's just a lesson learned. You move on. So I'm going to just use this very diluted blue, same as I did before. Brush that on, and down here as well. And then a bit of gray, same as I did before. And then I'm going to use my soft, damp, clean brush to soften that edge. And if you are able to tilt your paper, it can be kind of fun to let that paint flow, and you can actually influence the shape of the cloud. When you tilt the paper, it tends to pool up on the edges, so you kind of need to watch out for that. You don't want to leave big pools of water on the edges because it will dry it'll bloom back into the painting. I think I'll leave those for now. I definitely can't change anything on those because they're almost dry. The cellulose paper dries really, really fast because it doesn't quite soak up so much water. So now in the middle one, we're going to lean more towards the harder edges, not everywhere in the scene, but like on bits and pieces of it. And I'm going to introduce more and more paint. So we'll lean more towards the thicker paint down here. I'm going to make some room on my palette for some clean blue sky. So what I like to do is, again, start with my blue, diluted blue. Another thing I want to mention is that the brush direction, or how you hold the brush and touch the paper, actually matters. The bigger, fatter part of the brush here holds a lot more water, and if that's touching the paper, you're going to get a softer mark. Whereas this is a little sharper. It holds a fair bit of water and paint as well, but your mark is going to be a lot more noticeable, more prominent. It won't be quite as soft because, especially if you're angling the tip down, it's going to be pressing that paint onto the paper and making a very solid mark. So what I like to do is keep the fat part of the brush on the side where my soft edge of my cloud is. If my cloud is here, I'll always face my tip of the brush away from it. I'll show you what I mean. So I just got some blue on there right now, and so you can see the fat part of the brush kind of deposited the paint a little bit rougher, and then I can come back in with with a damp brush and kind of touch the edges of that. It is a little tricky with cellulose paper because, again, it's going to reveal most of your brush marks. So you may have to come back in with a bit more blue on the outer edge, but I'm still keeping the soft side of my brush towards the cloud. And I want a combination of soft edges and hard edges because that's what I see a lot in the sky. And you can also use your paper towel to sort of pick up if there's anything that's bothering you. Or if you want a really like bright hard edge, a paper towel can be perfect for that. And a bit of gray, so I'm just adding a tiny bit of burnt umber into my blue, just on the bottom edge of this. And I need to add a bit of blue into there too, otherwise it's too gray. And then if I notice any really hard edges starting to form, I can get a clean brush and sweep it over the edge. This is why we do lots of little studies like this, to experiment with our process of applying the paint, especially if you're using new paper that you're not used to. Okay, so we definitely have a bit of a harder edge here. In this one, I'm gonna, again, add more and more paint as I go, so I'm gonna paint a little thicker this time. I'm gonna get plenty of blue and white. So it's not super dark blue, it's still pretty light and a little bit desaturated because of that white. And I'm going to apply it to the outer edge of my cloud. The thing is with gouache, with painting clouds at least, is I actually prefer to use it more like watercolor because to me it looks a little bit more luminous. It doesn't look so heavy. Gouache is opaque and naturally to me looks a little heavier. So clouds, since they're so fluffy and ephemeral, I really like to utilize the softness of watercolor and the flow of watercolor. Just mixing up a kind of more diluted. It's still got a bit more paint than before, but slightly more diluted gray. And just going to touch the bottom. And down here as well. And then I can come back in with my clean damp brush and soften any of those edges because that's pretty hard edge there. As you go, as you experiment, remember to try to tilt your brush different directions. You might find that one direction works better for you in painting certain types of edges. So yeah, have a lot of fun with that, experimenting with that direction. So like I said, I'm keeping the fat part of the brush towards the cloud side, just tilting and swirling and then filling in the sky. And depending on if I used enough paint there, it might dry a little bit uneven, so I can always come back in with some more later if I need to. And now I'm going to do the gray underneath. What I like to do is just deposit the paint down and then come back in with a clean brush and sort of soften it and push it a little. And sometimes I also like to bring it all the way up to the edge, the top edge of the cloud, like up here, and let it flow, because it is going to behave a little bit like watercolor, just not as strongly. It doesn't flow quite as much, I mean, but you can still get some nice, fun, flowy effects. I just kind of dabbed the paint into it, and I know it's going to spread and flow. And again, if you're able to, you can tilt your paper a little and really see some cool effects. So up here we used it more like watercolor, very diluted. This one's got a little more paint involved, but you can still see the paper through it on the edges here, and I still used it kind of like watercolor. And down here we're going to use it with thick paint, so I'm not going to let the paper show through. It's going to be just like pure gouache covering the paper. You know, after you do a bunch of these, maybe a dozen or so, you really get a feel for what direction you prefer in your paintings. And it might depend on the scene itself, of course, but yeah, just try it both ways. So I'm mixing up my blue and my white again, and now I'm going to try to focus on painting more of a solid sky without lots of streaks. And to do that, ideally you won't have much water involved, because the more water involved in your paint, in your mix, the more streaky it can be, especially on cellulose paper like this. So I may struggle a little bit to get a nice even sky, but all I'm going to do is brush it from the right side in. I'm not even worried about the edge of my cloud yet, because I'm going to paint that after the fact. I'm painting around it a little bit because it does help to reduce the amount of mixing that's going to happen once I start adding my cloud color. If you're painting with solid gouache, I should say, you have to get your background completely correct before you move on to the next layer, because you can't really go back and fix it. I feel like there might be a little too much paint or water here, and it might dry with kind of a splotchy look. I'm going to use my heat gun to speed it up and see. It's actually not too bad. I think that works just fine. So we're going to move on. I'm going to make some room on my palette for some white. I'll pick up a decent amount of gouache on my brush and just kind of coat my brush hairs in it. This is still going to be diluted because there's a little bit of water in my brush, and that automatically will dilute the white. And because of that, the cloud will need a couple layers. I'm not going super, super thick yet. I want to slowly build that thickness. And I'll just lay it in. And I'm going to make brush strokes that mimic the shape of the cloud that I want. So if it's a kind of round, fluffy cloud, my marks are going to imitate that. And I'm overlapping the blue. And as I overlap the blue, it's going to start mixing with the blue, which means my white will be tinted automatically. And that's okay though, because we're going to come back with more layers later. And I use quick little flicks of my brush, because if I sit here and like try to make perfect little marks, I find that everything looks too stiff. But if I let things kind of swish and flow a little bit, I tend to make more natural marks. That's just something I experience. It might not be the same for everyone. I'm thinking about how the cloud is kind of moving into the scene, or maybe it's moving out of the scene, I don't know. I just want to show an example of a cloud with a very prominent edge. As you can see, anywhere that the white overlapped the blue, it is definitely tinted. So it's not pure white at all. And what I like to do now is let that completely dry, or in this case, speed up the process with a heat gun. I'm going to switch to my smaller brushes. These are actually flat brushes, and they're a little bit, the hairs are longer and very soft. So I'm able to gently press down on the paint, gently layer without lifting too much or mixing too much with what's below it. By the way, these are my custom brushes I made with Craftomo. There's a link in the description if you want to buy them. And when I'm doing this top layer of the cloud, I like to use a dry brush whenever I can. Of course, it's going to end up getting a little bit damp as I go, but I'll just keep my paper towel nearby and I'll constantly be drying it off. So in order to load up the paint, I will just get pure white and kind of coat the hairs in it. So over here. And then I'm going to sweep again in the same sort of fashion I did before with my quick little flicks of the wrist. And as I go, I'm going to need to constantly reload my brush because it's just sitting on the very surface of it. It's not in the brush. I'm not putting too much on at one time. And what I'm trying to do is get a dry brush effect. So it's kind of a broken brush stroke and little bits of what's below will show through. And when you kind of back up from the scene, it really lends itself nicely to that fluffy edge without looking too solid, because clouds aren't solid, they're gaseous. They're gases floating around, and I don't want to have like a perfectly solid edge. So that's why I like to do this kind of broken dry brush effect, and I'll just sort of cover everything I've done already. Now and then it's fine to have like some nice solid lines, but it needs to have a variety, otherwise it's too distracting. And then once I'm happy with kind of how that's looking, I will start incorporating a bit of the gray. So again, I'm going to mix a tiny bit of blue and a tiny bit of brown till it looks kind of like that's way too much brown. I want it to be, if you want it to be more of a warm gray, add more brown, or if you want more of a cool gray, stormy maybe, add more blue. I'm trying to go for more of like a neutral. But it's still very, very light. I can see next to this, the white here helps me compare how dark that's going to look. So if it's too dark, I can just add more white. And I'm going to sweep this on the bottom edge of the cloud. And again, it's still dry brush, so I'm letting it just sort of dance across the surface of the paper very gently. And up here, I'm going to sort of bring it up and around. But most of the gray is hanging on the bottom edge of the cloud because that's where it's heavier in the sky. And I think I'll leave it at this so we have something to compare it to. So we'll keep this one very light and soft. Maybe we'll try a bit more of a dense cloud over here and show the difference. So that's pretty much it. You can do one or two more layers like that depending on how much you need and how much it's mixing. And yeah, I definitely recommend doing it at least a few times at the small scale before going into a big painting. Get a feel for that. Next, we're going to do the same sky. I've got a nice blue and white mix here. If you were to be painting clouds above an actual landscape, you'll want the sky to shift from that dark deep blue to more of a light blue near the horizon. Just naturally lightens a little bit. You got a nice soft gradient. But in this case, we're just doing pure clouds, so I'm not too worried about that. And, if you want to, at this point, you could get a damp, clean brush and just soften the edge of these brush strokes because it's a little distracting. It might make it a little easier to paint on top of, but then we're going to let that completely dry again. So clean brush, plenty of white, coating my hairs in the white, and then sweeping it over that. This is the point where you design your cloud. So the first layer is just there to set the background, and now we're actually thinking about the shape of our cloud. And it's already mixing with the blue because it's a lot of blue on the paper. So I just want to get a fair bit of that mixed and on the paper, and then I can... One thing I do like to do, in combination with these fluffy clouds is I'll do some streaks maybe on the bottom edge. So like that, I just kind of gently sweep it across. The bottom of the clouds tend to be a little bit flatter, not always, but especially if they're sitting like heavy in the sky, they will be. So they won't be quite as like bulbous as the top side. Need to let that completely dry. And once again, picking up a fair bit of white gouache and just coating the hairs with that until it's pretty opaque on the brush, and then just gently sweeping it over. I'm sort of thinking that the right side of my cloud is the bright side, so I'm putting most of my bright white on that side. And then I try to let it surprise me now and then. Like I twist and I turn my brush and just kind of scrub it a little and let it apply the paint naturally without me forcing every single mark. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I like to let it surprise me a little when I paint. The more you experiment with how different ways to use your brush, the more that just naturally happens during the painting process. And now I'm going to mix up my gray again. Same strategy as before, just, bit of blue, bit of brown until I get a nice even gray. And if I have too much water, or I'm worried I have too much water, I'll press it against the paper towel on the backside. So there's still gouache there. And I can then test it out and sweep it on. There. I think that's a nice gray. Very dry brush, very dry marks, not too solid. Still has that nice fluffy appearance. And that's that. And you can go as dark as you want with the gray to make it more and more stormy, more heavy. But I think subtlety works really well with clouds. In this final piece, I'm going to work slightly different once it comes to adding the white of the clouds, but the rest is pretty much the same. So white and blue. As quick as I can, as even as I can in the background without touching it too much. And down here too. Now let's do it a little more wet into wet. So I'm going to jump immediately into the gray of my cloud, mixing the brown and the blue, a bit of white, because I do want it to be a lot lighter than the sky. Definitely make it lighter than the sky, otherwise it won't quite read. And I'm going to touch that in, and it's going to blend slightly with the blue. If you're using cotton paper, you'll have a lot more time to do this, but like I said, this is the cellulose, so it's drying really fast, and I might it might run out of moisture there, but it's still okay. On the left side of my big fluffy cotton ball shapes, I'm adding a bit more gray, and I can come back in with white. I typically don't want to repeat the same shapes so much. Like this is like boom, boom, boom. It's a bit too distracting, so I'll try to break that up a little. But you get the idea. And now we can start adding our white. And when it's wet like this, it's going to flow. My brush is kind of damp, and I just dipped it into the white. It's pretty thick. And I'll just touch it in. So this is more of a combination of like watercolor and gouache effects. It's thick gouache, it's opaque, and to me it looks very heavy, but it's fun because you let things flow a little bit more. So I'm just touching the white into the right sides, kind of overlapping it with the edges, like where the blue sky touches it and the gray below. And it's going to sort of swirl and flow, but definitely not as much as watercolor would because it's heavier paint. It's like, it's got some substance to it. So if you want, you can let it bleed and flow as much as you think it will. But what I like to do is kind of wait a minute and then I'll freeze it in its tracks by using the heat gun. If it's really, really wet and you tilt it, you may get some interesting effects. It's not a ton of water on my brush, but it is pretty damp, and I can kind of push it a little bit, just dabbing some water in there and then letting it flow. So that's another way you can get some interesting streaky effects. And I think the more spontaneous it looks, the better. But the problem with doing this is that because the paint is so heavy and white kind of takes over pretty quickly, it is unpredictable. And you may end up having to just paint on top of it anyway because it flowed too much or just didn't quite sit right. You have to take it painting by painting, I suppose. And then I will dry it with my heat gun. So after I blast it with that heat and it's still not dry in some spots, I feel like, no, that's just a little too much paint. So what I'll do is just dab it because I'm going to do another layer anyway, so I don't mind too much if I pick it up. I don't want tons and tons of gouache sitting on the paper. Then I will switch to my flat brush again and get it nice and dry. And do the same thing I did before, load up, coat that brush. And on the highlights of my clouds, like maybe the right side, like I said before, this is just sweeping it on toward, like I'm flicking my brush towards the gray side. So I'm kind of painting over the gray rather than what we did over here, which was painting gray on top of it. And you can get kind of carried away doing this, so, you know, be careful not to completely cover your gray, but it's going to have a similar effect, and you may end up with more spontaneous, flowy look in this type of, with this technique. Because I used a fair bit of color in the gray, it's a little more heavy, which I think it works well though. Oops. Did a weird little wispy mark there. The bottom. When you do this bright white kind of dry brush effect on top of the darker gray, I think it's really nice for a highlight. Just catches the light on the edge. Okay, there we go. So I definitely recommend trying each of these techniques and see what suits you better. See, maybe it depends on your scene, but having a feel for how to do each of these is going to help. It means that you have options when it comes to painting your landscapes.